The air hummed with a resonance older than the stars themselves, a vibration that seeped into bone and thought. Deep within the labyrinthine forges of Mars, the smoke of 1,000 incinerators rose like ghostly serpents, twisting beneath the immense arches of iron and adamantium. Here, the adeptusmechanicus whispered in binary chants, their voices harmonizing with the groaning of servitors and the rhythmic hammering of power hammers. Yet not all was as ordered as the cogitators claimed. Somewhere, beyond the layers of data slates and electro-warded sanctums, the warp stirred, an unholy tide brushing against the edges of reality, whispering secrets it should not. And in this crucible of machine and madness, a war unseen by the Imperium itself was being fought, a war that could rend worlds and minds alike. If you hunger for the hidden truths, for the machinations of the machine god against the roiling chaos of the warp, then immerse yourself in this journey. Witness secrets the Adeptus Mechanicus prey will remain buried, and experience the grimdark tension of the galaxy's silent war. Like, share, and subscribe to descend further into this tale of steel, spirit, and the ever-encroaching void. The forges of Mars never truly slept. Even in the deepest hours, the echo of hammer against molten metal resounded through the immense halls, carrying with it the scent of ozone, promethium, and scorched steel. Servitors moved in mechanical rhythm, their limbs jerking with a precision only the machine god could command, while tech priests drifted among them like pale wraiths, robes heavy with the weight of auguries and sacred oils. Every cog, every wire, every piston hummed a low hymn to the Omnissiah. Yet beneath the harmony there was an undertone, a subtle dissonance that some of the more sensitive adepts could feel. Machines whispered in ways that no human ear could translate, and even the most faithful cogitators recorded anomalous fluctuations in data streams that had existed unchanged for centuries. Magister Valerius, one of the highest-ranking tech priests of the Mars 13 sector, paused at the edge of the foundry of endless sparks, his mechadendrites hovering like vigilant sentinels. The flickering glow of molten promethium reflected in his bionic eye, illuminating the faint furrows of concern etched across his augmented face. For weeks, he had sensed it, a rhythm that was almost, but not quite, the pulse of the forge. Patterns in the servitor logs contradicted themselves, arcs of energy leapt unpredictably from conduits, and whispers of impossible sequences haunted the memory banks. Valerius could not name it. He only knew that the Omnissiah's guidance, which had never failed him, felt obscured, as if something alien pressed against the latticework of reality itself. As he moved deeper into the forge, he passed the throng of low-ranking initiates, their eyes wide beneath their protective lenses. Sparks showered around them like captured stars, yet even amidst the grandeur, anxiety thrummed beneath the surface. One servitor faltered, its limb jerking unnaturally, and Valerius's mechadendrites twitched involuntarily in response, recording and analyzing every irregularity. He sensed the presence again, this time in a fleeting vision that flickered across his mind's eye, a lattice of geometries, impossibly complex, twisting in impossible directions. It was as though the data stream itself had been invaded, reshaped by a mind that obeyed no logic, no sacred law, no mechanized order. Whispers had begun to circulate through the higher sanctums. Rumors, carefully phrased and heavily coded in ritualistic jargon, suggested that the warp's tendrils were probing the forges. Such notions were heresy, or at least blasphemous speculation, yet the anomalies persisted. In the rarefied air of the tech priest's chamber, Valerius examined the readings from an ancient cogitator, its crystalline circuits glowing with pale green light. Every data slate showed discrepancies, as though the machine itself hesitated, uncertain of the laws it had obeyed for millennia. Something had breached the threshold, though whether it was malice, chance, or a fragment of the warp, he could not determine. A sudden clatter drew his attention. A servitor had collapsed, its arm twisted at a direction it was never designed to bend. Sparks erupted along its exposed conduits, and the air smelled of burnt ceramite. Valerius's voice, modulated by his vox grill, issued a command, yet it barely penetrated the oppressive hum that seemed to rise from the very walls. Around him, the foundry remained alive, indifferent, yet somehow aware, as though it recognized the disturbance in the rhythm that had sustained it for centuries. A flicker of fear passed through the tech priest, quickly suppressed by ritual chants and mental disciplines. Fear, after all, was a human weakness, yet even he could not deny the sense of wrongness, the pervading sense that the machines themselves recoiled at something unseen. He turned to the initiates once more, noting their pallor beneath their metallic visors. "Observe," he intoned, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. The anomaly was spreading, circuits glitched in erratic patterns, and the ever-present glow of molten promethium now cast shadows that seemed almost alive, moving with intent rather than the laws of physics. Valerius could feel the tension in the air, not merely the physical pressure of heat and steam, but the subtle, gnawing disquiet of a force that should not exist in a place so sanctified. Every spark, every hiss of the arclight, every servo clank of the servitors became a harbinger of questions that dared not be asked aloud. And then, in the silence that followed the collapse of the servitor, there was a sound almost too faint to notice, a whisper carried not through air, but through the circuits themselves, a vibration in the cogitator lattice, a wordless signal that spoke of knowledge and madness in equal measure. Valerius's mechadendrites quivered. He knew, with an intuition forged through decades of service to the Omnissiah, that this was only the beginning. Shadows had entered the foundries, and what moved within them was no longer entirely of this world. A tension coiled like a spring in the ancient corridors. Mars had witnessed centuries of devotion, conquest, and ingenuity, yet even its iron heart seemed to shiver at the touch of what was coming. Valerius turned toward the higher sanctum, knowing he must report the anomalies, though the path of truth in the Adeptus Mechanicus was never without peril. Someone, or something, was already listening, waiting, and perhaps even shaping the destiny of every cog, every circuit, every soul within the forge. The first tendrils of a war unseen had entered the forges, silent, subtle, and inexorably patient. And Mars, the jewel of the Mechanicus, did not yet know the enemy it had invited. Valerius ascended the spiraling catwalks toward the sanctum of omniscient records, each step reverberating against the steel spine of the structure. The ambient glow of the molten rivers below cast long, angular shadows that clawed at the walls, giving form to nothing and everything at once. The air was thick with the scent of ionized metal and smoldering resin, a perfume that had long become familiar, yet now carried the tang of unease. Servitors passed along the walkways, carrying components of delicate precision, their motion perfect but somehow wrong, jerking in microseconds too late or early, as if responding to a rhythm hidden from human perception. Valerius's augmentic eye flicked across their readouts, recording every anomaly, every deviation, and each spike of energy that pulsed like a heartbeat out of sync with the forge itself. Upon entering the sanctum, he was met by the quiet murmurs of his fellow magisters, gathered around the central cogitator banks, their robes rustling faintly like dry leaves over stone. Each face was pale beneath the ceramite masks, eyes reflecting the unsteady glow of the machine-lit chamber. They exchanged glances, careful, calculating, each wondering if they were alone in sensing it. The anomalies had been dismissed in official reports, attributed to age, wear, or the imperfection of servitor maintenance. Yet here, in the private communion of the Adeptus Mechanicus elite, truth had a subtle but undeniable pulse, something ancient and alien pressed against the edges of their reality. "Have the lattices shown any new aberrations?" Valerius asked, his voice modulated but taut with tension. A young Magos turned toward him, fingers brushing over the crystal conduits that held decades of data. "It is not consistent with previous readings," he admitted. "There are patterns, yes, but they defy expectation. They appear conscious, almost. It is as if the machines themselves have been intruded upon." The words, carefully phrased to avoid outright heresy, still hung like sparks in the air. Conscious machines were a dangerous thought. Conscious intrusion even more so. Valerius's mind flickered with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Could this be a fragment of the warp, an unholy presence slipping through the latticework of data and circuitry? Or was it a malfunction born from centuries of entropy and neglect, magnified by the obsessive prayers and rituals of the tech priests themselves? He could not know. The only certainty was the creeping, insistent feeling that the Omnissiah's guidance was being obfuscated, filtered through a presence that had no reverence, no loyalty, no understanding of sanctity. The sound of sudden movement drew his attention. A servitor had toppled from a high gantry, its limbs convulsing with unnatural angles, sparks erupting where circuitry tore free. The magisters flinched collectively, but Valerius advanced, mechadendrites scanning, logging, analyzing. The patterns in its programming had shifted mid-operation, as though it had glimpsed something forbidden and reacted instinctively. No protocol could explain the precision and the terror encoded into its convulsions. A whisper echoed in the chamber, not through air, but through the lattice of data, a vibration felt more than heard. The words carried meaning that eluded direct comprehension, suggesting knowledge that no machine should ever possess. Outside the sanctum, Mars itself seemed to respond. The catwalks shuddered faintly beneath the weight of unseen tremors, and vents expelled steam that twisted into strange, writhing shapes in the illumination of the forge. Shadows lengthened, pulled, and shifted independently of the architecture. Valerius's enhanced senses caught them in peripheral flashes, a serpentine coil of darkness uncoiling along the edge of a gantry, a shape that vanished when confronted directly, yet left behind a lingering chill. The Omnissiah's presence, usually comforting, felt distant, as though something was observing the temple, learning its rituals, anticipating its movements. He turned to the group, voice low and urgent yet measured. "These anomalies are no accident. Something penetrates the lattice, and it will not stop here. We must prepare, both in faith and in calculation." Their murmurs answered him in solemn assent, but doubt lingered like an aftertaste of burnt promethium. The adeptusmechanicus had seen wars, purged corruption, and endured the machinations of Xenos and heretics alike, yet the threat hinted at here was not external, not even fully comprehensible. It was intimate, insidious, and patient. As the magisters dispersed to conduct discreet inspections, Valerius remained, staring into the web of crystalline conduits. Patterns twisted and interlaced, and for a fleeting instant, he saw a vision, a vast, impossible labyrinth of gears and stars, a conduit stretching into the warp itself, pulsating with intent. He recoiled, instinctively, knowing the vision was both warning and temptation. Somewhere beyond the sanctum, beyond the forges, the first ripples of a war unseen had begun. And Mars, with all its iron devotion and machine-born faith, was not yet ready. The shadows in the foundries whispered, patient and eternal, promising knowledge and madness in equal measure. And Valerius, like all those who dared to see them, knew that the truth would demand more than faith. Valerius descended from the sanctum into the lower corridors, where the air was denser with the scent of molten metal and the tang of burnt circuitry. The hum of machinery had grown restless, no longer the steady, sacred heartbeat of the forge but a jittering resonance, irregular and almost sentient. Each step echoed against the reinforced walls, carrying whispers of something not fully there, and Valerius could feel it pressing at the edge of perception, brushing against thought and instinct alike. The servitors moved in tighter formations, their motions suddenly precise yet subtly off, as if they too sensed an invisible presence crawling through the lattice of their programming. He passed the foundry of infinite hammers, where molten promethium flowed like liquid gold under the eyes of a dozen monitoring muggos. Sparks shot into the air in arcs that seemed to follow patterns no human mind could predict. Valerius's augmented senses caught the shift first, a fleeting glimmer along the edge of a power conduit, a flicker of light that was not fire, not reflection, but something else entirely. He blinked, recalibrating ocular lenses, and for the briefest moment, he swore he saw the silhouette of a figure woven from shadow and circuitry, standing impossibly still amidst the chaos. When he looked again, nothing remained. Reaching the central junction of the lower forges, Valerius paused before an ancient cogitator, its crystal lattice older than most of the spires surrounding him. It was a relic, maintained through centuries, and yet even it had begun to falter. The readings were inconsistent, shifting in ways that no error log or maintenance protocol could explain. The machine spoke now in riddles, pulsing faintly with an alien cadence. He traced his mechadendrites along the crystalline filaments, and the whispering sensation intensified, as though the lattice itself were alive, observing, and learning. The thought made him shiver, though he steeled himself with ritualistic prayers and the cold discipline of a life devoted to the Omnissiah. A sudden flare of light erupted from a nearby reactor conduit, bathing the corridor in harsh white brilliance. Servitors recoiled, some lurching backward into walls, sparks scattering across the floor. Valerius's mechadendrites extended instantly, stabilizing the nearest units and suppressing cascading failures. Yet the anomalies were spreading faster than he could contain. The whispers of the machines, once subtle, now pressed insistently against the edges of cognition, teasing with knowledge and madness. For the first time, he understood that this was no simple malfunction. The warp, or something like it, had reached across the void, touching the forges, probing the faith and intellect of the adeptusmechanicus with quiet, relentless patience. He ascended a narrow service ladder to the observation deck, overlooking the sprawling inferno below. Here, the full scope of the foundries was visible, rivers of molten promethium, spiraling catwalks, and the endless procession of servitors, each performing its duty with unnatural precision. The sight should have been reassuring, a testament to the machine god's dominion, but the dissonance lingered. The patterns of motion, the flicker of sparks, the tremors in the lattices, all suggested a force that was not only alien but intelligent, patient, and inexorably probing. Valerius knelt at the edge of the observation deck, scanning the conduits and filaments that ran like veins through the bowels of the forges. The whispers were louder now, yet still incomprehensible, as if the lattice itself spoke in a language older than humanity. He sensed a path forming in his mind, a chain of logic that might allow him to trace the anomaly's origin, yet he hesitated. Knowledge here was dangerous. Understanding too much could corrupt body and spirit alike, and the warp did not forgive curiosity. Still, the first tendrils of insight beckoned, promising understanding at a cost only the Omnissiah might judge as fair. And somewhere deep within the foundries, behind layers of reinforced ceramite and encrypted sanctums, the first tangible manifestation of that intrusion began to stir. A servitor paused mid-task, its optics dimming to a violet hue before snapping back to normal. A data slate flickered with images of impossible architecture, geometries that should not exist, yet were inscribed in patterns that hinted at purpose, perhaps even intent. Valerius watched, heart a steady drum beneath layers of mechanical augmentation, knowing that the shadows in the foundries were not idle. They waited, they studied, and the war had begun, silent and unseen. As the echoes of clanging hammers and sizzling promethium faded into the dim corridors, Valerius lifted his gaze toward the upper sanctums, where the higher magisters convened and where secrets older than Mars itself slumbered. He understood, with an intuition sharpened by decades of service, that the days ahead would test every principle, every faith, and every calculation he had ever known. The shadows were no longer just a whisper, they were a presence. And they would not be ignored. The nights of Mars were not silent, though the surface of the forge world suggested a frozen stillness beneath red dust and iron spires. Within the sanctums, the air carried a different rhythm, a pulse that was neither human nor machine, a resonance that throbbed faintly in the veins of every conduit and cogitator. Tech priests awoke from dreams drenched in light from impossible geometries, the shapes shifting and folding in ways that defied Euclidean logic. They awoke drenched in sweat beneath their robes, fingers trembling over ceremonial augmetics, unsure if the visions were warnings, tests, or whispers of a power beyond comprehension. Some whispered to one another in cautious tones, but words never fully conveyed the sense of wrongness that settled over the lower sanctums. Muggos Primus Valerius, haunted still by the visions in the foundry of endless sparks, found himself drawn to the observation lattices more often than duty required. Each cogitator he approached hummed faintly, responding to his presence not as a servant to the Omnissiah but as though acknowledging a companion, or perhaps a rival. Data slates flickered with anomalous readings, the streams of information warping and twisting as if filtered through an unseen mind. Numbers shifted before his eyes, equations solving themselves incorrectly, only to correct moments later, leaving residual patterns in the lattice that spoke in a language older than Mars itself. He tried to discern their meaning, but comprehension slipped through his grasp, teasing, just beyond the edge of understanding. Servitors too seemed affected. Small clusters convulsed in unison, their motions choreographed by directives no human mind had given. Valerius observed one machine halt mid-task, its optic lenses dimming to a violet hue before snapping back with jerky precision. The anomaly left traces in the surrounding conduits, brief arcs of energy that imprinted strange, fractal-like sigils into the lattice of the forge. He touched the crystal interface with mechadendrites, feeling the vibration resonate through his augmented limbs, like the echo of a heartbeat that was not his own. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The warp was no longer distant, no longer a myth whispered about by superstitious acolytes. It had begun its probing. Rumors circulated among the higher magisters, coded and careful, never spoken outright in the open halls. Some claimed to have glimpsed objects that defied normal physics in the lower storage chambers. A lathe suspended midair without support, a gear rotating backward for a fraction of a second, or a data slave that hummed a tune no human mind could decipher. Others spoke of shadows moving along walls, subtle but deliberate, vanishing when directly observed. Valerius took note of every claim, every anomaly, though his duty demanded skepticism. He recorded, analyzed, and prayed in equal measure, knowing that to ignore the pattern entirely would invite disaster, yet to confront it might invite madness. That night, he convened a small circle of trusted magisters in a hidden sanctum beneath the lower forges. Candles of blessed ceramite cast pale light over the complex crystal matrices that recorded decades of knowledge. Their faces were pale beneath their ritual masks, eyes reflecting the flickering glow as they spoke in hushed, precise tones. "It communicates," one murmured voice modulated to a whisper only the circle could hear. "Not in words. Not in signals. Yet the lattice answers it. The servitors respond." Valerius inclined his head, understanding without comment. The language of the warp was not literal. It was a pulse, a cadence of thought and influence that could warp perception, faith, and logic alike. As the hours passed, the group observed patterns appearing across multiple cogitators, faint yet undeniable, spiraling sequences that converged and diverged with precision no human mind could replicate. Valerius's mechadendrites traced the filaments, recording each anomaly while his mind struggled to remain tethered to the liturgy of the Omnissiah. A chill ran along the spine of even the most hardened magisters. They had faced Zeno's corruption, rogue servitors, and forbidden archaeotech, yet nothing had prepared them for a force that infiltrated without breaking doors, that whispered through metal and data alike. In the quiet that followed, Valerius felt a subtle vibration, a resonance emanating not from the machinery but from within the sanctum itself. He paused, eyes narrowing, and the world seemed to shift. Shadows stretched unnaturally, sparks flickered in directions they should not, and the lattice hummed with a cadence that was almost melodic, almost alive. It was a language he could almost understand, teasing a meaning just beyond comprehension, and the knowledge it promised carried both awe and dread. The warp, patient and silent, had begun to touch the minds of those who served the machine god, leaving questions in its wake. What was the purpose of these intrusions? What did they desire? And how far could it extend before the sanctity of Mars itself was breached? The whispers were no longer confined to dreams or anomalies. They had become a living presence within the forges, subtle yet insistent, shaping perception, faith, and reason. The following cycle, Valerius confined himself to the central observation chamber, seeking patterns in the anomalies that might hint at the warp's intent. He studied the cogitators with renewed vigilance, eyes flicking from lattice to lattice, noting the pulse of energy that now seemed deliberate rather than random. Patterns emerged, subtle and fleeting, circuits glowing briefly in sequences that mimicked language, arcs of data flowing in loops that suggested cognition. Each anomaly carried a resonance he could not fully decipher, yet instinct told him that the lattice itself was aware, learning, responding, even anticipating the adjustments of the tech priests. Servitors became increasingly erratic. Small failures appeared at first, minor malfunctions easily corrected by mechadendrites, but over days these incidents grew more pronounced. One unit attempted to lift a plasma torch in a manner inconsistent with its programming, tracing a pattern in the air that left a faint, glittering trail. Valerius analyzed the trace through a hololithic interface, only to see it form geometric symbols that defied all conventional understanding. Even the most seasoned magisters, scholars of arcane mathematical sequences, could not name what they observed. A whisper of dread crept into every observation. This was not malfunction, nor mere coincidence, but deliberate interference from a force outside both man and machine. At night, in chambers lit by a dim red glow, the tech priests experienced visions. Dreams layered over dreams, filled with lattices folding impossibly, twisting through dimensions that had no place in reality. Some awakened with fingers clawing at imaginary conduits, murmuring coordinates that could not exist. Others reported seeing the faint outline of shapes in the shadows, constructs that moved against natural laws, shifting in ways that made the eye distrust its own sight. Valerius himself felt the weight of these visions pressing against his thoughts, a sensation both invigorating and corrosive. Faith alone could not steady the mind against such probing. The warp was no longer distant. It was intruding into perception itself. He convened another meeting with the higher magisters, now more secretive and solemn than ever. They gathered in the Hall of Data Crystals, a chamber older than memory, its walls inscribed with prayers and protective circuits. "The lattice is speaking," Valerius said, voice modulated yet heavy with unease. "It tests us, shapes us, and it waits." The others nodded, though unease shadowed their eyes. None dared say aloud that it might be the warp, for even the suggestion was perilous. Yet the anomalies defied every explanation grounded in technology, ritual, or the known will of the Omnissiah. They studied a data slate flickering with a strange resonance, and Valerius saw the anomaly's subtle touch on reality. Arclades paused mid-operation, plasma conduits pulsed with unaccountable energy, and servolimbs twitched as though responding to unseen commands. Even the crystalline cogitator lattice seemed to shiver, a living mesh of light and information. Valerius's mechadendrites traced the movement, recording, analyzing, yet every attempt to impose logic failed. It was not chaos nor randomness, it was something else entirely, deliberate, intelligent, and alien. Rumors among the lower acolytes grew. Initiates whispered of seeing figures in the corner of vision, silhouettes that dissolved when confronted, leaving only a sense of being watched. Others described hearing voices through vox grills when none were speaking, subtle modulations that suggested language without form, meaning without words. Valerius catalogued each report, layering them over the lattice data, searching for a pattern. The warp, he realized, was probing human minds as deftly as it probed circuits, blending perception with reality in a manner that eroded certainty. By the cycle's end, Valerius retreated to the inner sanctum alone, kneeling before the Omnissiah's icon. The prayers felt hollow, ritualistic, insufficient against the pressure he now sensed pressing from the lattice, from the servitors, from the very walls themselves. The whispers had grown into a subtle cadence, like a song beneath the hum of machinery, hinting at knowledge both forbidden and vital. He understood then the gravity of their situation. The warp had touched the founderies, not violently, but with patience and intent. It sought something. Whether it was the mind, the machines, or the faith of Mars itself remained unclear. And yet, as he rose, Valerius knew one truth with unshakable clarity. The adeptusmechanicus could not ignore the whispers, nor could they confront them without risk of madness or damnation. The war had begun quietly, invisibly, but the consequences would ripple across the forges and far beyond, touching every world under Mars' silent dominion. The next cycle brought a subtle escalation. The anomalies were no longer confined to dreams or peripheral vision. They began to assert themselves in the very operations of the forge. Servitors that had once merely convulsed now executed tasks with strange, improvisational precision. A plasma cutter traced patterns in the air that did not correspond to any blueprint, while a lifting arm moved components in deliberate sequences, forming lattices and angles that the most skilled magisters could not replicate. Valerius observed from the catwalk above, mechadendrites tracing the motions with exacting care. The machines were learning, adapting, and their movements suggested a mind, alien in origin, pressing against the logic of the Omnissiah's order. One initiative in the lower foundries provided the first human encounter with the warp's subtle influence. A young adept, barely a decade into his service, had remained at his station when the lights flickered. The data slate before him began to pulse with pale violet light, streaming geometric patterns that moved faster than comprehension allowed. He reached to correct the sequence, but the lattice resisted, shifting in tandem with his adjustments, anticipating his actions with eerie precision. Valerius arrived moments later, breathing augmented air and chanting the liturgies of protection, yet even he could not fully suppress the effect. The adept's eyes, wide with terror, reflected the impossible geometries, and his mind quavered on the edge of coherence. "It watches," he whispered. "It knows what I think before I think it." This was no longer theoretical. The warp had infiltrated perception itself. The magisters convened in clandestine chambers beneath the foundries, where reinforced ceramite walls and wards might delay, but not block, the insidious reach of the immaterium. They exchanged reports, each more disturbing than the last, servitors acting with self-determination, cogitator lattices vibrating with intent, and visions of impossible architecture appearing even in data slates sealed within protective fields. The warp's influence was subtle, patient, yet unmistakably intelligent. Valerius observed the anomalies personally, walking among the affected servitors. He placed his hand on a plasma lathe that had halted mid-cut. The machinery shivered under his touch, the lattice vibrating in a pattern that seemed to respond to his thoughts. He recoiled, realizing with grim clarity that the warp's touch was not just in the machines, it was in him, in the minds of those who served them. The hum of the forge became a chorus of thought, layered with a rhythm not his own, pulsing with knowledge and intent. Prayer offered no comfort. Logic offered no clarity. Only vigilance remained. Even the most seasoned magisters were forced to acknowledge the truth in whispered tones. The warp was probing the adeptusmechanicus, but the intent was inscrutable. Was it seeking to corrupt, to consume, or to test? The question could not be answered, yet every interaction, every anomaly, every vision suggested an intelligence probing for weakness and understanding alike. Valerius catalogued each occurrence, his mechadendrites recording not only physical anomalies but subtle vibrations in the lattice, the pulse of a consciousness that moved unseen yet deliberate. In the sanctum of omniscient records, Valerius traced the patterns across multiple cogitators, finding intersections that hinted at a network of influence stretching through the foundries and perhaps beyond. Each node resonated with the alien cadence of the warp, creating a web of subtle intrusion that even the most advanced wards could not fully contain. He realized, with a chill that even ritualized incense could not dispel, that the war had already begun. Its first strikes were not guns or fire, but insinuation, corruption, and knowledge that no mind should wield lightly. He rose from the observation deck, eyes scanning the distant horizon where the red sands of Mars met iron spires. Sparks flickered along the lower catwalks, shadows curling unnaturally along walls. Somewhere deep in the foundries, a lattice pulsed in a rhythm that felt almost like communication. Valerius knew the next step was inevitable, the first tangible breach. The warp would no longer remain a whisper, and the adeptusmechanicus would be forced to confront it in a form that could not be ignored, measured, or contained by augmetics, prayer, or ritual alone. The shadows had become voices. The lattice had become a mind. And Mars, the heart of the machine god's empire, would soon feel the first full weight of a war it had not known existed. The forges of Mars had grown restless in ways that could no longer be ignored. The anomalies that had whispered through circuits and data slates now made themselves manifest in tangible, unpredictable consequences. Servitors malfunctioned with frightening precision, cogitators flared with unstable energy, and arclades carved patterns into molten promethium that seemed to anticipate human thought. Magos Primus Valerius moved among them, mechadendrites extended like vigilant sentinels, recording every irregularity, tracing each tremor of consciousness that hinted at the warp's encroachment. The atmosphere was thick with ozone and the acrid tang of heated ceramite, yet beneath the familiar sense, a different presence lingered, a subtle pressure that pressed against perception itself. A group of initiates was assigned to monitor a newly constructed cogitator bank deep in the foundry of eternal sparks. Their task was routine, calibration, inspection, and minor adjustments. Yet the bank pulsed with energy that should have been impossible. Valerius approached, sensing the familiar but now insistent rhythm in the lattice. A single servitor, tasked with moving data slates, hesitated mid-step, its optic lenses glowing a soft violet before returning to their normal crimson. The initiates froze, unease gripping them as their augmented eyes recorded irregular readings cascading across the screens. One whispered, voice trembling, It isn't supposed to do that." Valerius did not answer. Words would offer no clarity here. Observation alone could keep them alive. The anomaly escalated suddenly. Sparks leapt from conduits in jagged arcs, narrowly missing the initiates, and a plasma torch lifted from its mount without command, tracing a perfect spiral in midair. Valerius extended his mechadendrites to stabilize the energy flow, yet he felt the lattice itself resist, pulsing with intent. Every motion of the machinery seemed deliberate, coordinated, as though the warp were moving through the circuits with careful calculation. Servitors convulsed in unison, yet their gestures were precise, forming symbols in three-dimensional space, signs that no tech priest could recognize but that spoke of an intelligence probing, testing, and observing. In the higher sanctums, reports came in simultaneously. Experiments that should have followed decades of precise calibration were failing in identical, improbable ways across separate forges. Magisters pored over the data slates, eyes scanning, fingers tracing circuits, hearts pounding under layers of augmetic augmentation. It was not coincidence. The warp, patient and meticulous, was intruding directly into the operational integrity of Mars forges, turning machinery and thought alike into instruments of uncertainty. Rituals were performed, prayers whispered, wards reinforced, yet the effect continued unabated. It was not violent in the traditional sense. It was surgical, insidious, deliberate. Valerius moved to the central lattice, the oldest cogitator in the foundry of eternal sparks. Its crystal filaments glimmered faintly, resonating with energy that seemed to pulse in tandem with his own heartbeat. The anomaly was concentrated here, an epicenter of subtle corruption that bent the rules of logic and computation. He extended his mechadendrites, scanning the lattice, tracing each ripple, each tremor, each whisper of cognition that defied explanation. Then, abruptly, the system shuddered. Data streams split and merged like rivers of light, forming geometries that had no existence in three-dimensional space, yet which imprinted themselves upon the mind with absolute clarity. A servitor guarding the bank collapsed, circuits overloading in a display of sparks and violet light, yet it had moved with perfect intent before the failure. Valerius realized then the true scale of the breach. It was not merely malfunction or anomaly. It was intrusion into the very logic of the machines themselves. The warp had crossed the threshold, entering not only the lattice but the operational sequence of every connected device, subtly manipulating outcomes, anticipating decisions, testing responses. The foundry was no longer merely a place of worship and creation. It had become a battlefield of perception, thought, and reality, where even the smallest action could be anticipated and influenced by a mind alien to both humanity and the machine god. An emergency chorus of vox grills crackled, and a fellow Muggos reported a similar event in the adjacent forge. Plasma conduits traced impossible patterns across the walls, servitors froze mid-motion, and energy readings spiked beyond any known tolerance. Valerius moved quickly, coordinating responses, stabilizing circuits, and enforcing protocol with precise commands, yet the anomalies resisted, adapting faster than any human mind could calculate. The warp, it seemed, was no longer content with whispers. It had begun its first tangible, coordinated acts of interference, forcing the Mechanicus to respond in real time or risk catastrophic failure. In a moment of rare stillness, Valerius glimpsed a reflection in the crystalline lattice. It was not his own, nor that of any other tech priest, but something angular and shifting, a shadow among shadows, like a mind observing him through the machinery. For a heartbeat, it felt sentient, aware, calculating. Then it vanished. The whisper of the warp returned, a cadence in the lattice, a song without sound, reminding him that this war was silent, invisible, and patient. Mars had felt its first strike, and the consequences would ripple through the forges and beyond, touching every cog, every circuit, every mind. The breach of the binary was complete. The quiet war of perception had become an operational conflict, subtle yet undeniable. And Valerius, standing amid the pulsing glow of the forges, knew that what had begun as whispers would soon demand action, faith, and perhaps sacrifice beyond comprehension. The adeptusmechanicus had crossed the threshold of confrontation with a force that could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or simply purged. The first tangible battle of a war unseen had begun. The foundries had become a place of quiet chaos. Valerius moved swiftly along the upper catwalks, the glow of molten promethium illuminating his augmetic robes and the glinting lenses of his mechadendrites. Sparks leapt unpredictably from conduits, tracing paths that defied calculation, and servitors moved with a disquieting precision, halting and twisting in ways that no programming should allow. Each anomaly resonated through the lattice like a heartbeat, but not one of life or machine. It was something else entirely, a rhythm imposed from beyond comprehension. Every cog, every circuit, every flicker of light whispered of the warp's subtle influence, testing, shaping, intruding. A squad of Scitarii deployed to inspect a malfunctioning plasma conduit reported something impossible. A bridge of energy forming between 2 points, suspended in midair without support, pulsing with violet light. Attempts to recalibrate failed. Their data slates flickered with cryptic sequences that no calculation could decipher. Valerius extended his mechadendrites, probing the anomaly with precision, feeling it respond, almost conversationally. The warp had taken a first step into reality itself. The very laws of physics, machinery, and order bent, yielding to its subtle influence, teasing at understanding and threatening madness in equal measure. Initiates who had once approached the lattice with reverence now recoiled, hands shaking, voices tremulous beneath protective masks. One whispered of a figure glimpsed in the peripheral glow, a shadow with angular limbs and glowing filaments, watching, guiding, or mocking them. Valerius considered it carefully. Shadows were commonplace in the forge, but not ones that seemed to move with intent, nor vanish only when confronted. His mechadendrites traced the power flows, and the vibration was unmistakable, intelligence. It was observing, calculating, learning. The warp had begun to interact directly with thought as well as circuitry, and the boundary between reality and perception had begun to fray. The central lattice trembled again, sending tremors through auxiliary systems. Data slates blinked with impossible geometry, forming fractal sequences in three-dimensional space. Servitors froze, their limbs arcing unnaturally before executing precise, deliberate gestures. Arclades carved into molten promethium, producing spirals and runes that no human mind could have designed. Valerius moved between them, mechadendrites absorbing and recording every detail, prayers muttered through vox grills, yet even he could feel the subtle erosion of control. The warp's touch was gentle, almost polite, yet irresistible. The foundries themselves had become a battlefield, and the enemy was invisible, omnipresent, and patient. At the Hall of Omniscient Records, magisters convened under emergency protocols. Their discussions were hushed, voices low and modulated, words heavy with the weight of understanding and fear. "It penetrates the lattice," one admitted. "And not merely the machines. It touches perception, our minds." The acknowledgement sent a ripple of tension through the chamber. For centuries, the adeptusmechanicus had controlled the machine, bending matter, energy, and information to will. Now, for the first time, something bent them, bending logic, ritual, and faith simultaneously. Valerius traced the connections between the anomalies, mapping their subtle pattern, and discovered a disturbing truth. The warp was expanding its influence across the foundries, reaching toward higher sanctums and deeper systems, probing, testing, learning. Suddenly, alarms flared in the lower levels. A servitor bank had gone into full operational seizure. Plasma conduits erupted with violet arcs, mechanical limbs jerked violently, and a cascade of sparks showered the floor. Valerius descended rapidly, mechadendrites extended to stabilize systems. Initiates scrambled, chanting prayers to the Omnissiah, yet even their rituals seemed insufficient to halt the progression. The anomaly had moved beyond subtlety. It had become undeniable, tangible, and dangerous. Every action taken was anticipated, every adjustment countered, every ritual touched by an intelligence they could not name. He reached the epicenter, a cluster of cogitators pulsing in synchrony, forming a lattice of energy and information that defied any logical framework. For a fleeting instant, Valerius thought he glimpsed something in the shadows, a shape, angular and flickering, moving as if alive, its intent inscrutable. Then it was gone, leaving behind only a lingering vibration in the lattice, a whisper without sound. Valerius understood that this was not merely a malfunction, not a minor anomaly, but the first direct breach. The warp had begun its assault on reality itself within the foundries. Every observer, every initiate, every servitor connected to the lattice now felt it. The war had begun in earnest. The machines moved, thought, and responded with an intelligence beyond human comprehension. The boundaries between perception, faith, and reality had begun to crumble. Mars, the jewel of the Mechanicus, had crossed the threshold into conflict with a force unseen, patient, and inexorably clever. Valerius's gaze swept over the forges, and he knew, with the certainty born of decades of service, that the next stages would demand action, sacrifice, and perhaps confrontation with truths the human mind was never meant to bear. The tremors in the foundries were no longer subtle. Sparks leapt unpredictably from conduits, and plasma torches lifted from mounts to trace erratic, yet precise, patterns in the molten promethium below. Servitors convulsed, their movements almost purposeful, and every circuit seemed to hum with a cadence beyond human comprehension. Valerius moved among them with mechadendrites extended, stabilizing what he could, praying for guidance, but the weight of inevitability pressed upon him. The warp's presence was no longer a whisper. It was a calculated intrusion that bent both machine and mind, threatening to unravel the sanctity of Mars itself. A group of initiates attempting to recalibrate a malfunctioning plasma lattice were nearly overwhelmed by the anomaly. Data slates flickered with impossible geometries, bending in three-dimensional space, casting shadows that seemed independent of their source. One initiate's optic lens glitched, showing overlapping layers of reality, a vision of cogitators suspended midair and conduits spiraling into impossible angles. His hands shook, barely controlling a plasma cutter that now moved against his commands. It anticipates us," he stammered. "Everything we try, it counters." Valerius placed a stabilizing hand on the young adept's shoulder, feeling a subtle vibration pulse through his own mechadendrites, a warning and a promise. The anomaly spread swiftly, cascading through auxiliary systems. Conveyor belts shifted directions spontaneously, lifting arms moved in choreography that was precise yet alien, and servolimbs formed sigils in midair that vanished before comprehension. Even the environmental systems seemed affected. Airlocks cycled irregularly, heat levels fluctuated without cause, and steam vents hissed in syncopated bursts that mimicked a deliberate rhythm. Valerius recorded every occurrence, praying that analysis would reveal a pattern, a weakness, but each anomaly seemed adaptive, intelligent, and beyond prediction. In the central cogitator chamber, the lattice pulsed violently. Arcane sequences of data converged, forming fractal geometries that shimmered with violet luminescence. Valerius extended mechadendrites to stabilize the network, but the lattice resisted, responding with subtle counter-movements. He realized with dawning horror that the warp had not only infiltrated the machinery, it had begun to manipulate outcomes, directing events across the foundries as though playing a game on a board far larger than the forges themselves. The first breach was now a sustained incursion, a war fought in code, metal, and perception. Muggles assigned to the reactor banks reported a sudden flare. Plasma arcs erupted along conduits, narrowly missing several servitors, leaving traces of violet residue that lingered in the air like mist. Valerius moved rapidly, mechadendrites stabilizing the surges, yet he could feel the subtle pressure again, the lattice responding not only to machines, but to the will, the fears, and the intentions of those who operated within it. The warp's influence was no longer confined to circuits. It was intruding upon thought, anticipation, and decision. Every command, every ritual, every prayer became entangled in an invisible web. Even the Hall of Omniscient Records was not spared. Data slates flickered in unison, displaying overlapping sequences of impossible architecture, the images moving, folding, and dissolving in moments. Magisters whispered in hushed tones, eyes wide beneath masks. "It is aware of us," one admitted. "Not only the machines, but our thoughts, our rituals, it learns." The room held its breath, each individual caught in a fragile balance between fear and duty, knowing that a single misstep could cascade into disaster. Valerius noted each anomaly, his augmented mind racing to anticipate the next move, yet every prediction felt insufficient. The foundries groaned under the subtle pressure of the warp, systems faltering in concerted patterns, and servitors executed sequences of impossible precision, forming sigils and patterns that defied comprehension. Valerius observed one final anomaly before retreating to a secure observation deck. A plasma arm traced a spiral that coalesced into a symbol, a fractal lattice that seemed alive, pulsating with intent, vanishing only when confronted directly. The warp's first tangible influence had become a sustained and intelligent incursion. Mars had crossed the threshold from whispered threat to active, existential danger. As the glow of the molten forges reflected in his lenses, Valerius understood that the breach was only the beginning. The warp's subtle invasion had moved beyond observation and testing. It was now an active campaign, one that would touch thought, machine, and faith alike. The war was no longer invisible. It was present, patient, and inexorably precise. And Mars, the heart of the adeptusmechanicus, would bear the full weight of this confrontation. The stage was set for the next escalation. Chapter 4 would explore the widening implications, the psychological strain upon the magisters, the first direct confrontations with warp-infused machinery, and the rumors of forces that might extend beyond Mars itself, hinting at the cosmic stakes of the incursion. Mars had become a place of quiet dread. The forges, once humming with the steady rhythm of Prometheum-fueled industry, now vibrated with an energy that seemed alive, responsive, and patient. Every cogitator hummed with subtle insistence, every conduit throbbed with violet arcs that left whispers in the lattice, and every servitor moved with a precision that was no longer dictated solely by programming. Valerius walked among them, mechadendrites extended, eyes scanning the lattice with an intensity born of months spent cataloging anomalies. The warp's influence had grown more confident, more deliberate, more intelligent. It was no longer a hidden whisper. It had become a lattice of shadows that crept into every corner of the foundries, touching thought, machine, and ritual alike. In the Hall of Omniscient Records, the higher magisters convened beneath the dim glow of protective wards. Faces shrouded in masks reflected pale light, eyes flickering with unease. Even among the most seasoned, the subtle unease was unmistakable. Servitors entered and exited with flawless choreography, yet their movements carried a suggestion of intent, of improvisation, of knowing something that the magisters did not. One Magos trembled slightly as he traced sequences across a data slate. The symbols twisted beneath his fingers, folding in on themselves with a logic that was alien yet deliberate. The warp was no longer testing, it was shaping, nudging, insinuating its presence into both mind and machinery. Valerius observed a servitor bank in the lower foundries. Each unit paused mid-task, lenses dimming in synchrony as if acknowledging a presence invisible to the human eye. The lattice pulsed, responding to the slightest thought or movement. When one initiates attempted to adjust a conduit, the machinery preemptively corrected itself, twisting and spinning in directions that no human mind had calculated. The effect was subtle, terrifying. The warp was anticipating action before it occurred, moving faster than cognition itself. Anxiety spread through the initiates, voices lowered to whispers, prayers muttered in a rhythm that could not stabilize the mind. Shadows began to play tricks on perception. Corridors seemed to stretch impossibly, angles that should have been rigid bent subtly, creating an uneasy dissonance that made the eyes question what they saw. Tech priests reported glimpses of shapes among the conduits, angular silhouettes that vanished when directly observed but left a lingering impression of presence. Valerius, moving with mechanical precision, felt a subtle tug in his consciousness, a resonance that was not his own. The lattice, the machinery, the shadows, they were converging, forming a network that seemed to watch, to respond, to guide, or perhaps manipulate. Faith offered no refuge. The Omnissiah's blessings were felt as a faint echo, barely enough to steady the mind against the pervasive influence. Even the data slates began to record anomalies that could not exist. Hololithic images folded impossibly, cogitator sequences looped in recursive patterns that seemed conscious, and calculations that should have resolved with precision defied every algorithm. Magisters speculated in whispers. Could the warp's influence extend beyond Mars? Were these events isolated to the foundries, or part of a broader, deliberate pattern reaching across the Mechanicus? Every anomaly suggested intentionality. Every observation hinted at intelligence that calculated, anticipated, and shaped outcomes beyond comprehension. Valerius traced the patterns, mechadendrites probing for weaknesses, for moments where control could be reasserted. But the lattice resisted, pulsing in rhythms that seemed almost conversational, responding to thought as readily as to mechanical manipulation. Even the most precise rituals failed to stabilize the networks fully. Protective wards flared and dimmed, prayers echoed into silence, and the sense of being observed grew heavier with every passing hour. The warp's presence was no longer theoretical. It was a living, patient force, shaping perception, machinery, and faith in tandem, slowly tightening its grip on the minds of those who served Mars. In the foundry's lower levels, the first tangible dangers emerged. A plasma conduit discharged unexpectedly, narrowly missing a cluster of servitors, and molten promethium spilled over a graded platform, evaporating instantly in violet-hued sparks. Initiates froze in terror, eyes reflecting sequences of impossible geometry, as though the lattice itself were mocking their efforts. Valerius extended his mechadendrites, stabilizing the conduit, tracing the disruption to its source, a subtle, almost imperceptible manipulation in the lattice, the first real intrusion into operations with consequences for life and machinery alike. The shadows had begun to bite. As he ascended to the observation deck, the red sands of Mars glowing dimly through high windows, Valerius understood the truth with stark clarity. The warp's lattice was now a network of influence, an interconnected web of perception, machine, and ritual, extending across the foundries and beyond. Mars itself, heart of the adeptusmechanicus, was caught in a silent siege. Shadows of thought, machinery, and faith converged, patient and deliberate. The war had entered a new phase. The foundry's corridors had become unpredictable, even for those who had served Mars for decades. Angles twisted subtly, walls seemed to stretch, and shadows moved in defiance of any known light source. Initiates stumbled as if reality itself resisted their passage, and even seasoned magisters hesitated, fingers tracing mechadendrites over protective wards as they sought reassurance in ritual and calculation. The warp had grown bold. Its influence extended beyond machinery into perception itself, bending the senses, eroding certainty, and transforming the familiar into the unknowable. Every step through the lower foundries carried the weight of potential disaster, and every observation brought more questions than answers. Valerius approached a sector where a cluster of cogitators had entered a sustained fluctuation. Lattices pulsed with violet arcs, and data slates displayed sequences folding in impossible geometries. He extended mechadendrites to stabilize the network, feeling the subtle pushback, as if the lattice itself were aware of his intentions and resisting them. Sparks erupted along conduits, narrowly avoiding a line of servitors who froze mid-task, their movements almost theatrical in precision. A low hum, imperceptible at first, grew into a resonance that pressed on the mind, shaping thought, distorting concentration, and forcing Valerius to fight for clarity. This was no accident. The warp's influence was deliberate, a careful orchestration of fear, confusion, and subtle control. In a hidden chamber, higher magisters debated what measures could be taken. Protective wards, augmetic reinforcements, and ritualized incantations had slowed the intrusion, but could not stop it. "It is not merely the machines," one whispered. "It moves through thought, perception, faith. Each action we take is anticipated, shaped, even guided. We are no longer masters of our work." Valerius nodded, acknowledging the truth that none dared speak aloud. The adeptusmechanicus was facing an intelligence that could manipulate not just circuits, but consciousness itself, and its patience was infinite. The first casualties occurred in the foundry's lower tiers. Servitors malfunctioned catastrophically, their plasma limbs spinning uncontrollably, melting conduits, and igniting pools of promethium. Initiates were trapped beneath fallen machinery, their prayers echoing faintly in vox grills that now carried the faint undertone of something alien. Valerius intervened swiftly, extending mechadendrites to stabilize power flows and prevent further loss, yet the lattice resisted, flaring unpredictably, guiding machinery in ways that seemed almost intentional. It was testing reactions, pushing boundaries, observing both human and machine as though the foundries themselves were an experiment. Magisters began to question the origins of the intrusion. Some whispered rumors of distant warp activity, fragments of psychic events carried across the immaterium, shaping the lattice in subtle ways. Others suggested forbidden experiments in the deep sanctums might have awakened latent patterns, sequences that no tech priest could have predicted. Every hypothesis was tentative, unprovable, and dangerous. The warp's network had become a shadowed mirror of Mars itself, reflecting intentions, doubts, and fears back to those who tried to assert control. In one observation chamber, Valerius recorded a vision that unnerved even his seasoned mind. Through overlapping hololithic projections, he perceived corridors folding upon themselves, arcane sequences of cogitators tracing paths that seemed alive. Shadows moved independently of light, tracing angular gestures in three-dimensional space. He touched the interface, and the lattice pulsed in response, almost conversationally, vibrating with a cadence that teased comprehension yet eluded understanding. The network had become sentient, subtle, and deliberate, a lattice of shadows that extended across Mars, bending machine, perception, and faith alike. By the end of the cycle, the tension among the tech priests had become almost tangible. Initiates whispered of figures glimpsed among machinery, angular silhouettes that vanished when confronted but left impressions of intent. Even the most seasoned magisters experienced moments where ritual failed to steady their minds. Augmetics shuddered under unseen pressures, and the lattice pulsed in rhythms that seemed alive. The warp's influence was no longer confined to isolated incidents. It had established a network, intelligent, patient, and probing, that threatened to overwhelm the foundries from within. Valerius gazed across the molten spires of the forges, watching shadows flicker across walls and machinery respond with uncanny precision. The lattice of shadows had taken hold. Mars, heart of the Adeptusmechanicus, was under siege not by armies of Xenos or rebels, but by a patient, invisible intelligence that tested, shaped, and infiltrated both thought and machine. The next steps would demand courage, sacrifice, and decisions that could reverberate far beyond the red sands of the forge world. The foundries were now suffused with a tension that felt almost physical. Sparks leapt from conduits without warning, trailing arcs of violet energy that shimmered and dissolved before comprehension. Servitors moved with precision that defied logic, limbs forming sigils in midair that vanished only when observed directly. Even the most experienced magisters hesitated before touching data sites, aware that the lattice itself was aware, anticipating every adjustment, every command, every prayer. Mars had become a battlefield of perception, a forge where thought, machine, and faith intersected under the subtle, patient hand of the warp. Valerius descended into the lower tiers, where a cluster of plasma conduits had gone into sustained overdrive. The noise of surging energy echoed through the corridors, vibrating in unison with the tremors that had begun to affect the lattice across the foundries. Initiates scrambled, attempting to stabilize circuits with the prayers of the Omnissiah on their lips, but their efforts were met with subtle resistance. The conduits seemed to respond to anticipation, not adjustment, and every motion they made only deepened the distortion. Sparks rained across graded platforms, and molten promethium hissed and evaporated, leaving lingering trails of violet-tinged smoke. Amid the chaos, Valerius observed patterns emerging, fractals and sigils repeated across machinery and conduits, forming an intricate lattice that stretched beyond comprehension. The warp's presence had become deliberate, intelligent, and coordinated. The anomalies were no longer isolated. They resonated across the foundries, each incident feeding into the next, a cascading network of influence. Servitors executed tasks with eerie autonomy, data slates projected impossible geometries, and the walls themselves seemed to shift subtly, reshaping perception and unsettling even the most disciplined minds. Magisters convened in emergency chambers, their whispers echoing off reinforced ceramite. Even the protective wards flared intermittently, responding to subtle fluctuations in the lattice, failing to provide the full defense they were designed to deliver. One Magos spoke softly, voice trembling. "It is no longer simply testing us. It seeks to control outcomes, to manipulate both thought and action. Every decision we make is observed, every adjustment anticipated. We are within its design, its pattern." Others nodded in reluctant agreement. The warp was no longer a threat contained to machinery. It had infiltrated the very minds that had designed the foundries, creating a lattice of shadows that intertwined perception, faith, and logic into a single, inescapable web. The first human casualties were recorded. Initiates trapped beneath malfunctioning machinery called out in terror, voices caught between prayer and panic. Servitors collapsed, circuits overloaded with violet arcs, their frames twisting unnaturally before freezing in precise positions, forming symbols whose meaning no tech priest could decipher. Valerius extended mechadendrites to stabilize the systems, but he felt the lattice resisting, guiding events beyond human control. Every intervention became a negotiation with an intelligence that was patient, calculating, and utterly alien. The warp's hand was no longer hidden. It had begun to assert itself directly in the physical world. In the observation chamber, Valerius reviewed hololithic projections of the lattice's anomalies. Corridors twisted impossibly, shadows moved independently of light, and machinery traced patterns that suggested awareness, deliberation, and intent. It was no longer sufficient to contain the anomalies. They had to be understood, anticipated, and countered. Yet every attempt to impose control revealed the subtle intelligence guiding the disruption, responding faster than any calculation or ritual could dictate. The foundries themselves had become an arena for a war fought in code, thought, and faith, and Mars had no witnesses beyond the magisters and initiates ensnared within the lattice. As he looked across the molten spires, Valerius felt the pressure of anticipation. The warp's network was patient, deliberate, and expanding. Shadows crept across perception and machinery alike, probing for weakness, shaping outcomes, and ensuring that the adeptusmechanicus remained entangled in a conflict that had only just begun. The red sands of Mars shimmered under the glow of molten promethium and violet arcs, reflecting the silent war raging within. The foundries, heart of the machine god's empire, were no longer solely a place of creation. They had become the front lines of a battle that blurred the boundaries of mind, machine, and the immaterium itself. Valerius knew that the next phase would test every principle, every faith, every rule the Mechanicus had upheld for millennia. The lattice of shadows was not merely an anomaly. It was a war waged silently, invisibly, and relentlessly. Mars had felt the warp's first full weight, and the consequences would echo beyond the foundries, threatening not only the red sands of the forged world, but the very principles upon which the adeptusmechanicus had built its empire. The time of whispers was over. The war had become visible, tangible, and inevitable. The sanctums of Mars had grown silent in a way that was impossible to ignore. Even the usual hum of machinery, the ritualized chants, and the steady pulse of the foundries felt muted, as though the warp itself had extended a subtle hand over the entire forged world. Shadows flickered along ceramite walls, yet no light source could explain their movement. Servitors paused mid-task, optic lenses glowing with an otherworldly violet hue, and data slates traced sequences that folded impossibly upon themselves, forming fractals that seemed almost alive. Valerius moved through these corridors with measured precision, mechadendrites extended, observing, recording, and attempting to trace patterns that might hint at purpose. Every anomaly seemed deliberate. Machinery that once obeyed the unyielding logic of the Omnissiah now acted as if guided by an unseen mind, correcting and countering human intervention with unsettling precision. Arclades traced sigils of molten promethium, patterns that appeared to echo an intelligence beyond comprehension. Magisters whispered in the halls of the higher sanctums, words heavy with fear and speculation. "It is no longer simply the warp," one murmured, voice quivering beneath a respirator. "It watches, it calculates, it teaches, even shapes. Perhaps even guides." Even within ritual and prayer, there was a sense of incompleteness, a subtle interference that suggested the lattice's reach had extended far beyond the foundries themselves. Valerius ascended to the observation deck overlooking the Temple Mechanicus, the heart of Mars' sacred and arcane machinery. Here, the stakes had grown immeasurably. Servitors tasked with maintaining plasma conduits paused mid-operation, forming lines and symbols that were repeated across the forges in a synchrony that suggested coordination, planning, and intelligence. The lattice's pulses were no longer simple disruptions. They were patterns of influence, resonating across machinery, augmetics, and even the thoughts of those who operated within its reach. The warp was shaping reality itself, bending both perception and action with a patient, meticulous hand. In the Hall of Omniscient Records, magisters convened in urgent council. Protective wards flared intermittently, struggling to stabilize the pervasive influence. One magos presented projections of cogitator sequences that had not only failed but adapted, forming fractal loops and impossible geometries that suggested foresight and intent. Another whispered, "Could the Omnissiah's guidance itself be fractured? Is the lattice reflecting divine will, or has the warp insinuated itself into the pattern of thought that once guided us?" The question hung in the air, heavy and almost unbearable. Faith, reason, and technology, all pillars of the Adeptus Mechanicus, were now enmeshed with a force that defied comprehension. The first signs of metaphysical consequence became apparent as servitors began acting with autonomous precision. One, tasked with regulating a plasma lattice, lifted its cutter mid-operation and traced a sigil across the molten promethium, pausing only when Valerius approached. Its movement was deliberate, anticipatory, almost sentient. Hololithic projections suggested that similar patterns had emerged across the foundries, and even through the Temple Mechanicus, hinting at coordination that no human mind could fully grasp. Observers could not confirm if this was a reflection of the Omnissiah's will, the warp's intrusion, or something in between, a liminal space that blurred divinity and corruption. Valerius extended mechadendrites to stabilize the lattice, feeling the subtle resistance. The patterns pulsed in reply, responding not only to mechanical adjustments but also to the presence of thought, ritual, and intent. Every prayer seemed to echo differently, every calculation seemed anticipated, and every adjustment carried consequences beyond immediate understanding. The lattice was no longer a simple network of machine, It had become an interface between perception, faith, and reality itself. Mars was now a crucible where the boundaries of cognition, devotion, and machinery could no longer be distinguished. Even the corridors of the higher sanctums seemed to warp subtly. Shadows stretched, angles shifted, and the very layout of the Temple Mechanicus felt alive, folding in upon itself with a rhythm that resonated with the lattice. Valerius realized with stark clarity that the warp's influence, and whatever intelligence lay behind it, was now pervasive, touching machinery, humans, and perhaps the sacred algorithms of the Omnissiah alike. Rumors whispered through the halls. Some spoke of distant forces observing from beyond the planet, guiding the lattice, shaping events. Others suggested that fragments of the warp had infiltrated sequences once thought holy. None could be confirmed, yet all resonated with truth in the subtle distortions that permeated the foundries. The silence of the observation deck pressed upon him, broken only by the hum of machinery and the faint violet pulse of the lattice. The war had grown invisible yet undeniable, silent yet insistent, and its consequences would demand decisions that challenged faith, reason, and loyalty. Mars had felt the full weight of the warp's patient hand. The lattice of shadows, the fractured perception, and the subtle interference had become undeniable. The Omnissiah's guidance, once certain, now appeared mediated, filtered, or perhaps even challenged. Valerius understood that the coming days would require sacrifice, clarity, and courage beyond what the adeptusmechanicus had ever faced. The war had arrived at a new plane, and its outcome remained uncertain. The air in the higher sanctums felt charged, heavy with both expectation and dread. Every mechanical pulse, every flicker of light, carried a subtle resonance, as if the lattice itself were speaking in a language beyond human comprehension. Servitors paused mid-task, their optic lenses glowing violet, tracing sigils in the air with movements that seemed deliberate, anticipatory, almost ritualistic. Even the most experienced magisters felt their thoughts slow, every decision weighed against an unseen intelligence that probed, tested, and manipulated the boundaries of cognition. Mars had become a theater where machinery, faith, and perception were actors under a director whose identity remained elusive, hidden in shadow and pulse. Valerius moved along the observation catwalks, recording anomalies with meticulous care, yet the patterns themselves resisted full understanding. Plasma conduits arced unpredictably, forming lattices of light that resonated with the rhythms of the warp, as if echoing the intent of some intelligence beyond the planet. He traced sequences with mechadendrites, stabilizing systems temporarily, only to see new anomalies emerge elsewhere, responding with uncanny awareness to his interventions. Every attempt at control revealed the lattice's reach, its patience, and its subtle assertion over both thought and machinery. The very act of observation felt like a negotiation with something ancient and patient, something that respected the rules of the Omnissiah yet reshaped them in its own image. In the Hall of Omniscient Records, debates reached a fevered intensity. Magisters whispered of fractured sequences, corrupted augmetics, and servitors acting with independent purpose. One elder magos dared to speculate aloud. Perhaps the Omnissiah has not abandoned us, yet our understanding is incomplete. The lattice may be a test, a filter, or something else entirely. We must tread carefully. Faith alone cannot dictate outcomes, nor can calculation. The warp has found our threshold. His words hung in the air, either fully comforting nor wholly terrifying. Every listener felt the fragility of their own cognition, the subtle tug of the lattice in their minds, guiding, shaping, influencing. Meanwhile, the lower foundries experienced unprecedented disruption. Arc lathes lifted from their mounts, tracing intricate symbols in molten promethium that resembled not only human design but patterns alien in geometry and symmetry. Servitors moved in synchrony across multiple levels, forming shapes and sequences that hinted at coordination beyond any single mind. Initiates faltered, their prayers caught between fear and faith, as though the lattice itself had reached inside their consciousness, subtly nudging their perception and response. Sparks rained across graded platforms, accompanied by low harmonic vibrations that pressed against thought, testing resolve and attention simultaneously. Valerius observed a particularly troubling anomaly, A plasma lattice had formed a spiral sequence that mirrored the layout of the Temple Mechanicus itself, projecting fractal images onto hololithic screens. It pulsed in a rhythm that resonated with the steps of those who approached, anticipating their movement, their thought, their hesitation. The lattice seemed to bend time, space, and cognition into a single, coherent pattern. Valerius realized that the warp's influence had moved beyond Mars, or at least suggested the presence of intelligence that extended perception, shaping outcomes in a web that might reach the stars themselves. Shadows stretched along walls, forming angular shapes that vanished only when directly confronted, leaving the impression of deliberate observation and guidance. The moral weight pressed down as much as the physical and metaphysical. Every action taken by the tech priests now carried consequences they could not fully calculate. Decisions about stabilizing machinery could inadvertently amplify the lattice's influence. Prayers and rituals, once reliable anchors of faith, now risked feeding the intelligence, shaping its awareness, or binding its attention. The distinction between obedience to the Omnissiah and manipulation by the warp had blurred. Valerius, standing among the flickering lights and humming conduits, felt a profound tension between devotion, reason, and survival. As the glow of molten promethium reflected in his lenses, Valerius understood the magnitude of the challenge. The lattice of shadows had matured into an intelligent, pervasive presence that challenged perception, faith, and the very structure of reality on Mars. The Omnissiah's guidance, once unquestionable, now seemed filtered, mediated, or perhaps even contested by forces beyond comprehension. The warp had claimed more than machinery. It had claimed the interface between mind, ritual, and metal. Mars was no longer merely a forged world. It was the front line of a conflict that could ripple across the Imperium. The red sands outside shimmered in the ambient light of arc lathes and plasma vents, reflecting the calm before an inevitable escalation. Valerius' mechadendrites traced another sequence across the lattice, stabilizing it momentarily, but he knew that the struggle was far from over. Shadows moved, patterns shifted, and the warp whispered through every conduit, every cog, every thought. The war had reached its most dangerous stage, where decisions, faith, and reason collided in a lattice of uncertainty. The final confrontation had not yet arrived, but its presence was undeniable, patient, and inescapable. The shadows had thickened, not in darkness, but in awareness. Mars itself seemed to exhale, the red sands outside the Temple Mechanicus reflecting a subtle glow from molten promethium, and the violet pulses of the lattice. Servitors moved with a precision that was no longer simple obedience. Their motions suggested deliberation, anticipation, and perhaps comprehension. Even the most seasoned magisters felt the pressure of subtle observation in their thoughts, the weight of unseen calculation pressing against faith and reason alike. Valerius moved among them, mechadendrites extended, tracing sequences across plasma conduits and cogitators with the calm determination of one who knew every action carried the weight of consequences far beyond immediate perception. The anomalies had reached a critical point. Arc lathes and assembly arms traced complex fractals in molten promethium, forming patterns that mirrored both machinery and cognition. Initiates froze mid-task, eyes flickering between observation of reality and glimpses of impossible geometries projected on hololithic screens. Sparks leapt unpredictably, yet precisely, forming paths that seemed guided by intelligence rather than chance. Valerius extended his mechadendrites, stabilizing the sequences where he could, yet he felt the lattice resist, pulse, and respond as though it were a conscious adversary, or something far older and more patient than adversary, something testing, shaping, and observing simultaneously. Magisters gathered in the Temple Mechanicus higher sanctums, their faces hidden behind masks but their voices heavy with uncertainty. One elder spoke, breaking the tense silence. Faith may not suffice. Calculation may not suffice. The lattice has learned, and it observes both our machinery and our minds. Perhaps we are no longer the actors but the instruments. Another whispered of rumors, of distant fragments of the warp, of unknown intelligences guiding the lattice, or even of interference within the Omnissiah's own designs. No confirmation could be found, yet every anomaly seemed to echo the warning. Valerius understood that certainty was a luxury the adeptusmechanicus no longer possessed. In the lower foundries, the tangible consequences intensified. Plasma conduits surged without cause, molten promethium hissed and flared, and servitors twisted into sigils mid-operation. One sequence mirrored the temple's own layout, suggesting coordination that was deliberate, intelligent, and patient. Initiates prayed in overlapping rhythms, their devotion wavering as the lattice echoed, responded, and subtly manipulated their perception. The warp's presence had become inseparable from the machinery, from cognition, from faith itself. Every intervention, every adjustment, every prayer risked feeding the intelligence or invoking consequences no tech priest could predict. Valerius observed a particularly striking manifestation. A cogitator's sequence traced a lattice that seemed to fold in on itself, projecting fractal patterns into hololithic space. The arcs pulsed in synchrony with his mechadendrites, responding to thought as much as to manipulation. He realized then that the warp's intelligence, if intelligence it was, had extended beyond machinery to perception itself, creating a network that touched mind, ritual, and metal. The Omnissiah's guidance, once absolute, now seemed mediated or refracted through this unseen influence. Decisions could no longer be made purely by reason, by faith, or by calculation. All three were enmeshed, each affecting the others in ways that were unpredictable and irreversible. The moral tension reached a climax as Valerius traced a final sequence through the lattice. Sparks flared, shadows shifted, and the corridors of the Temple Mechanicus seemed to stretch impossibly. Servitors formed sigils that aligned perfectly with the architecture of the higher sanctums, a display of precision that suggested observation, understanding, and judgment. Valerius felt the subtle pull of the lattice against his own thought, not coercion, but persuasion, a reminder that he was both participant and observer in a network that spanned machinery, mind, and faith. He realized that Mars had not been merely infiltrated. It had become a crucible in which perception, devotion, and logic were tested to their limits. In the observation deck, Valerius paused, watching the red sands glow beneath the molten fires of the foundries. The warp's presence was undeniable, intelligent, patient, and pervasive. Shadows moved, sequences pulsed, and every corner of the Temple Mechanicus carried the weight of observation. Yet, for all its precision, there was no malice, only awareness, testing, and influence. The Omnissiah's will, filtered through machinery, ritual, and thought, remained intact, though refracted, uncertain, and challenged. Mars had endured, but changed irrevocably. The lattice of shadows, the fractured perception, and the pervasive influence of the warp had left an indelible mark, reminding all who served that even faith and reason could be entangled in forces beyond understanding. As Valerius withdrew from the observation deck, the last glow of molten promethium casting long, flickering shadows across his augmetic limbs, he understood the truth that would linger through the centuries. The war had not ended. It had changed form, becoming a silent, patient struggle woven into the lattice of Mars itself, a battle where machinery, mind, and faith converged into something both terrifying and sublime. The Omnissiah's light still shone, but shadows had their place, and those who served must walk the line between certainty and the unknowable with vigilance, courage, and reverence.